Welcome everyone to Feed Your Please. My name is Joseph.
I'm your co-host, Peter.
We have a very special, unique opportunity here today, something we've only done ever once before. We've invited another live human into this show so that we can have a conversation about Star Trek. Very excited. And this gentleman's name is Tom Salinsky, and Tom has written a book about reviewing Star Trek episodes. You can see why we would be very interested in speaking to him.
Right up our alley.
Absolutely. The name of his book is Star Trek Discovering the TV Series. It's actually going to be on sale here next week on March 30th. Primarily, like most people, you can get it on Amazon. But if you happen to be in the United States like us, you can get it at Barnes & Noble online as well. And Tom, he's not just a Star Trek fan. He's written a book about Red Dwarf, much along the same lines. He's somebody who's got some experience in producing, shall we say, nerd content. I don't know how much else to describe Big Finish audio dramas to a U.S. audience, but enough of that. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Tom, you coming to us from across the pond, it opens so many doors and so many questions. Joe and I are intricately familiar with being rancid nerds over here in the United States. Tell us about yourself. How old are you? Which is weird that age really factors into like the world of nerddom at this point. What's your background? And what's brought you to this point?
Now, I think the age question is a good one because I think a lot of your nerd obsessions will depend on what was on TV and in cinemas when you were about 10. And I was about 10 in about 1982. So I could go and see Star Trek 2 in the cinema. And then if I wanted to re-experience it, I could read the novelization by Vonda McIntyre because we didn't have a VCR.
That's a real way to frame things, though. I mean, the constraints of the technology in terms of how you're able to consume media. Once upon a time, and you've got about 10 years on Joe and I, and despite that age gap, you've got much more hair and much more of it's darker than us. So
yeah, well
I don't
done.
know if that
It's that good British breeding. I'm sorry. This is true.
The lack of GMOs, maybe. But you're talking about the necessity of reading books to go back and enjoy stuff versus now, all of the media is available instantly with minimal effort and maybe a couple subscriptions to tanking media distribution platforms. Star Trek, I'm looking at you. But, I mean, that's a great basis for the importance of books and something that would bring you to this point where you're actually out there dedicating pen to paper to write books on Star Trek in a format that, you know, is going to be lost to a lot of people. What is your history specifically with Star Trek?
So that's one of the reasons why I ended up doing this project and writing this book. So the project was to watch Star Trek from the original series to Enterprise at the rate of one episode a day.
Trek a day, I believe you call it.
I calculated would take me almost exactly 2 years. One of the reasons for doing that is that I've always been interested in science fiction, fantasy. As you said, I've written stuff for Big Finish, been a Doctor Who fan since I was about 9 or 10 years old. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, all of that stuff. But Star Trek, just sort of for various reasons, some of them to do with being the age I am and being brought up where I was, Star Trek sort of slipped through the cracks a bit. The original series wasn't being shown much when I was growing up. I think there were occasional episodes on BBC Two. But they did a big repeat in the 90s, by which time I was off at university and trying to build a career and so on. And then Next Generation, my first experience of that was going and renting VHS tapes with 2 episodes per tape. And they would release a new one of those about once a month. So it took a very long time to get through season 1.
Tom, I've experienced watching the original series the same way, by the way. What, 2 episodes to a VHS tape, and I went through them all in my local Hollywood Video.
Finally, it came to BBC Two, and I think they showed seasons 1, 2, and 3. And then there were no plans for them to purchase season 4, but luckily somebody had thought to offer them Best of Both Worlds Part 2. Otherwise, that could have been a very long wait. And then at some point, not long after that, Sky Television got the rights, but only about 15, 20% of UK homes actually had a satellite dish and could receive that. So it was actually hard to keep up with this stuff. So I had a friend who would do what he could to tape them off air because he had a Sky dish and I didn't. but I didn't see everything. And then, so it was an effort to try and keep up with everything. When the Blu-rays came out, I bought those, and so I finally caught up with Next Generation, and that was 10 years ago. So I started thinking, how much of this stuff have I actually seen? And then figured out I could actually see everything in 2 years at the 1 episode a day rate. So that's what I did. And having done that, it seemed a shame not to share my big important thoughts with the world. Thus the book.
Well, we certainly understand that impulse, right?
Yes.
That's crazy. They only went up to season 3 on Next Gen, because like season 1, as I'm sure you discovered and documented, is just riddled with trash.
It's a bit uncertain, shall we say.
That's very generous of what's the perception as you've kind of grown into the world of Star Trek? What was the perception of Star Trek in your youth versus where it's at in current day UK?
So I think that moment of Next Generation coming back feels very key to me, because Star Trek in the 60s had been always under the threat of cancellation because no one was watching. And then it was a huge hit in syndication after it had been cancelled. But then even when the movies were being made and they were being successful, all the late night talk show hosts, all the sketch shows were constantly making jokes about how old the cast was. And then nobody thought that bringing the show back without Kirk and Spock was going to work at all. This was seen as madness. I mean, you guys probably know this, but they couldn't get a network to back them. They had to do these, like 70 or 80 individual syndication deals in order to make sure that homes across America could actually see this show. It's absolutely, it's nuts. But it's Next Generation that was the big hit. It was really only Next Generation that was a mass audience, big, solid commercial hit while it was actually on the air. So it's a weird thing because it's this enormous cultural monolith which has influenced so much of the media and culture around it. And yet, for so much of its existence was a minority appeal.
I do think that there's a lot to be said for, and you touch on this in your reviews of the original series movies, of Star Trek 2, 3, and 4, really opening the door to allow TNG to be made at all. Yeah. And Peter and I just recently started doing the TOS movie reviews for our Patreon. We did Wrath of Khan, obviously just an absolute classic, something that revitalized the entire franchise into something that had a future because of its incredible success. But Star Trek 4 was actually financially the most successful film out of all of them. It made mainstream success in the way that I don't think any other Star Trek film really ever did.
It was the most profitable, but the motion picture is the one that made the most money. No Star Trek picture made more money than the motion picture until, I think, First Contact.
No, that makes sense. That does make sense, because I do recall that motion picture cost just a ridiculous amount of money, so it wasn't very profitable.
I think I say this in the book, but Disney's The Black Hole came out the same year and was the most expensive picture the Disney Corporation had ever financed. It also cost half as much as Star Trek the Motion Picture. I mean, the motion picture it was insanely expensive. That's famously Harve Bennett walked into Paramount's office to talk about Star Trek, and they told him how much the first movie had cost, and he said, "I can make you 5 movies for that much." And he's not far off the mark if you look at the numbers.
Well, everybody saw the wheelbarrows full of cash that Star Wars was bringing in.
Exactly.
And so, hey, why not jump back and just a complete mismatch between what Trek had been, what Roddenberry had wanted it to become, and what happens when you get a situation where the studio has a hard time saying no. Or just pushing cash at something and thinking, hey, what's the worst that could happen? To your book, you're doing the full Star Trek review, and I was excited to hear about it. So far, we've watched Voyager, and we're finishing off Enterprise right now. Voyager, DS9, Enterprise, the Braga properties that are omitted. What was the motivation to stop with Next Gen in the movies?
Oh, there's a second book. So in fact, the second book is probably going to be split into 2 books, so there'll be 3 books. But the project was to watch everything from original series to Enterprise in release order, to the point where I was actually interleaving watching DS9 and Next Generation and Voyager and DS9. So everything in strict release order. So yeah, I have big important thoughts about Deep Space Nine and Voyager as well. You're just going to have to wait a year or two to see them in print, but I can share some off the cuff thoughts with you.
Well, I was going through your Twitter, the Trek a Day comments, and
Yes.
It led me to some interesting place. I saw you just hit Demon and Mirror Mirror right there at the tail end of season 4. I got a good laugh out of the President Will Ferrell comments about the Minister of Earth, which
I see it. Yeah, I definitely see it.
You realize? Did you recognize who that was?
I probably did at the time. I don't remember now.
Tam Elbram from the Tin Man episodes.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I always love with Star Trek is the willingness to reuse actors.
Yeah.
And just the bleed between Star Trek being a science fiction fantasy adventure and a very real business that has been had been in place for a long time. The stuff that goes on behind the scenes, how the money works, and just, getting a feel for these directors who produce the stuff, their styles, and just seeing like, okay, to us, it's a spaceship adventure with guys flying around and beaming through the air. To them, it's a 9 to 5. They gotta get product out. You got people like Dave Livingston that just did a bajillion episodes, and we're monsters for getting things out on this production line. And just knowing, who can get the job done the right way. And you see those people come up frequently across the properties. It's a lot of fun.
Speaking of Enterprise, just briefly, so we can get a free preview, perhaps. I knew how rough a journey it was going to be at the start, right? Like, I knew going in, like, boy, these first 2 seasons, Peter may decide he doesn't want to do this anymore. You get to a night in sick bay, and you really start to question how you're spending your free time. But season 3, and then particularly season 4, just really phenomenal Trek that I think most people don't know existed.
No one was watching. No
one was watching. Enterprise didn't have the kind of success in syndication opportunity because it was a network television program. So that sort of ability for TNG just to kind of keep popping up in places and to catch people and to get them in Enterprise is never going to be able to do that. And it's a shame, of course, because it produced solid gold Trek content that was just qualitatively some of the best that was ever made during the entire Berman era. And then no one saw it.
Yeah.
Again, rightfully so. I mean, they really poisoned the well hard those first couple of seasons.
And there are problems I think they can't get away from. One of the things that I think is interesting about Next Gen, and one of the things I say in the book, is yes, that first year is rough, but all the decisions they can't get away from turn out great. Like, all the world building is great. The cast is pretty much uniformly great. And those that aren't instantly making an impact really grow into their roles over the years the show is on the air. The ship looks great inside and out, all that stuff. So all the things, all the kind of story of the week stuff, well, you can fix that as you go. I think the problem that Enterprise has is there are problems they can't get away from. And not all the casting works out at all. And for me, one of the pleasures of Star Trek is watching really competent people that I can aspire to working beautifully together and solving incredibly difficult problems. Whereas on Enterprise, again, particularly in the first 2 years, but to be honest, throughout, what you have is a bunch of doofuses who I do not want representing me on other planets at all in any way.
So you're on
Trip being maybe the worst offender.
Oh, you see, here I was going to say, like, if you're saying that Anthony Montgomery's a charming piece of wood and maybe not the best actor.
Sorry?
Anthony Montgomery, the guy who played Mayweather.
Who?
Oh yeah, like who is this?
I have no recollection of this person whatsoever.
He didn't have an episode after season 2, so why would you?
Yeah. It's weird to only have a cast of 6 characters.
It's very true.
And then even more weird that with that tiny cast of characters, they do everything. Like there's no one else on board this ship who seems to have a role of any kind. To the point where even when there's an engineering problem, it's the weapons guy who comes down to help. I mean, it's nuts. It's absolutely nuts.
That's one of the big things we really harp on is that Reed was just a terrible character overall. Like, he'd make a great science guy, but making me believe that this is your weapons guy who in his spare time is creating Federation shields that at that time only worked against semen monsters, or learning how to overclock phasers and all these other huge leaps of engineering coming from your gun guy.
They have a whole episode with him which is all about the fact that he doesn't have a personality, to the point where even his parents don't really know who he is.
Right, and
there's hanging a lantern, and there's just not doing the work.
And the production ability having degraded as badly as it did, is that episode was paired with an episode when the ship is nearly about to be destroyed by a bunch of interlopers who are invading them with technology they can't counter. So A plot, sinister alien force is going to kill them. B plot, Hoshi has to figure out what his favorite dessert is. Like, it's just, wow, two great tastes that don't taste great together at all. Good job, guys.
We have a pretty big international listener base, percentage-wise.
Big is very relative. That's a lot
one
of work.
Of the things that was brought up when
I was going to sell a lot of books appearing on this show, guys.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot of books.
You can look forward to all four of them being sold.
Which Lamborghini are you going to buy first?
Well, that's always the question, isn't it?
One of the things we heard was that there was a big turnoff to Enterprise because whereas the previous Star Trek had been future people doing, great feats of humanity, Enterprise really felt like Americans in space. And as we started watching, I think that really rang true. What was your perspective on that? And what degree do you think the previous Star Trek entries, or even the later stuff, how much America, fuck yeah, do you see bleed through there?
Well, I mean, that third series is all about America's response.
Space 9/11.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that does taint it a bit. The worst thing I think a science fiction series can do is attempt to be of the now. It's fine to, and Deep Space Nine does this incredibly well in many episodes, to tell stories about what are important social issues and couch them in allegory and disguise them in science fiction trappings. But when you're trying to be doing up to the minute satire, your show is going to date so fast. And that season also has the problem that it's fairly clear they were making this shit up as they went along. Because one of the things that kept bugging me about Series 3, and maybe this is just too much fridge logic on my part, but it opens with this incredible super weapon carving a great chunk out of the Earth. And then the whole of the rest of the season is like, we're nearly ready to test our super weapon. Wait, what? Excuse me now? What now?
I think that they do a good enough job near the end of the season to explain that Degra didn't really necessarily want to do what he was doing. And so that was part of the reason why he was taking his time. Such that I can forgive they're spending a lot of time charging this laser. This is a really long charge time for this laser. What's going on here?
But you do have to kind of squint at that. And again, it's one of those... Yeah.
You got to work at that.
Yeah, decision you can't get away from. I do think Degra is a wonderful character, and that kind of Mission Impossible style episode with him and Archer is, as you say, that's really good Trek. And it's good Trek because it's good science fiction and it's really good character drama. And going all the way back to TOS, the thing that really leapt out at me when I started watching those episodes again, and I think the thing that made so many Americans and people across the world clasp it to their hearts so dearly is because we loved hanging out with Kirk and Spock and McCoy, and we loved finding out more about them week after week. And they became fascinating characters.
Going into the book, sitting down, getting ready to type those first words, what did you find the hardest part?
So it was all written in kind of note form as I went along. So a lot of it was just tidying up. So I guess when I came to turn it into a book, the first thing I was thinking was, how much context do I need? So I ended up, this had to be cut down because we had my publisher and I, some detailed conversations about word counts and numbers of pages and how big a book they were prepared to print. So this was cut down by about a third in the end, but there's a little essay at the beginning about how Star Trek came to be, which is like, beginner's guide about who Gene Roddenberry was and what else was on TV at the time, and Lucille Ball's role in getting the show on the air, and Star Trek versus Lost in Space and Mission Impossible and so on and so on, just to kind of fill all that in. And then I did The Cage, which I actually watched, I think, on something like December 30th. Because I started on January the 1st, 2022, and finished Enterprise on Christmas Day, 2023. But I just slotted in The Cage because I thought, I'm gonna watch The Cage. And that was actually, I'm really glad I did, because The Cage is a fascinating trial run.
Yeah.
Have
Yes.
you guys both seen it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there was a VHS that had both it and Menagerie on it so that you can watch both back to back to kind of see how.
Yeah, and do you guys know this story as well? There was obviously the Menagerie is this panic-stricken. Oh God, we are weeks behind. We have to magic 2 episodes out of thin air. Quick, let's see if we can turn the episode with Jeffrey Hunter into something. And so when the script was more or less worked out, Gene Roddenberry handed over his color 35mm print and said, "Here, you should find everything you need." And he assumed that they would make a copy, and they assumed they hadn't been given the only copy.
Oh no.
And that's why, when it was first shown on TV, half of it was in black and white because they only had the material that had been put into the Menagerie, and the rest of it they only had as a black and white work print. And it wasn't until many years later that a color copy turned up and they were able to patch it together. I think it was a color copy lacking the sound, but they were able to kind of patch all the bits together.
No, I definitely remember the mismatch when I watched it, and there was a real point because there was an intro video. I think it might have even been by Leonard Nimoy to say like, "This is why it is this way." We had a color bit, so we did what we had for the Menagerie, but the rest was all just still in black and white.
But it's often called cerebral. That's the word that always comes. Oh, it's too cerebral. Again, too cerebral for Americans. They won't understand it. It's too good for TV. It's too cerebral. And watching it, I kind of knew what they meant. But what I really thought was lacking was there's no camaraderie among the crew. And when you have number one and other people whose names I don't remember because they aren't in any other episodes, trying to figure out what they're going to do in order to get the captain back, it's like they're solving space Sudoku. They're not worried about their dear friend, Christopher Pike, who they are fearful for his safety. They're just like, well, what are our options here? It feels cold.
Clinical.
Yeah, clinical. And once again, a problem that would have been difficult to get away from, that the way that Pike is written and played is he's this kind of battle-scarred veteran who's considering giving up being part of Starfleet. Would be hard to make that work over 70, 80, 100 episodes. And so then when you watch the first series of Kirk, it's a completely different ballgame. And the crucial difference, I think, is not only does Captain Kirk like being captain of the Enterprise, absolutely crucially, William Shatner loves being Captain Kirk. And suddenly there's this warmth and enthusiasm that's so vital. And that, I think, is the key to why this all lasted so long. Because, like I said, with Next Gen, you can fix the scripts if the stories aren't that great. You know, the first 6 stories of the original series are all, something stuck on board the ship when we weren't looking. But you don't notice and probably don't care because you want to see how these guys cope with it. I'm not quite sure what question you asked, but
well, I mean, it ties back to like sitting down to write the book, and something I hadn't thought about was you sit down to write a book about Star Trek. Who are you writing this book to? Are you writing it to the built-in audience, or are you trying to snare in other people that normally wouldn't think twice about Star Trek? And now, hey, here's a good cover. I wonder what this might be about. Like that's going to make a fork that has 2 wildly different approaches.
And I had to not constrain myself regarding spoilers. So in the introduction, I say, this is a book for fans. There will be spoilers. But I would love it if somebody who only had a passing knowledge of Star Trek started flipping through this book, read a couple of spoilers, and then thought, no, I need to watch this for myself. That would be the best compliment I think anyone could pay me.
Yeah, get a little peek behind the curtain and I'm seeing something I like.
Yep.
What
exactly.
is this? Okay, let me explore this more. Maybe I put this down for a second until I have some knowledge.
You've clearly done a ton of research on this stuff. Can you walk me through what your investigation process has been like? Is Memory Alpha something you're looking into heavily, or do you've got different sources to come up with these facts and figures?
I use Memory Alpha just to kind of double check things. The book was always intended to be my personal reaction, so I wanted to try and make sure I didn't make any obvious blunders. But there was stuff I didn't know, stuff I didn't know to expect, stuff that wrong-footed me. And when it was interesting, I kept that stuff in. But I am interested in behind-the-scenes stuff. One of the other books I read as a child was the Stephen Whitfield Star Trek: The Making of a Television Series book, which I have an incredibly well-thumbed copy of. I think I picked it up in a secondhand bookstore when I was about 11 or 12. And that was one of the first books of its kind, first book going behind the scenes of really any television show, let alone Star Trek. And there's all sorts of fascinating stuff there. So I think I repeat it's an old story, but it was worth retelling. But I remember it from the Whitfield book that in the Man Trap, because the story is about a creature that craves salt, they had to have futuristic salt shakers. Well, what do they look like? So some props guy went and scoured local Los Angeles flea markets and stalls and so on, and came back with an assortment of peculiar-looking objects, all of which he assured the production company could be used to season food, but none of them look like salt shakers. So can you use them in a scene? Well, now you can only use them in a scene if somebody picks it up and goes, the salt shaker, thank you very much. I don't mind if I do. So they ended up just using regular 1966 salt shakers. But so the props guy hadn't had a wasted afternoon as he left, whoever it was, Gene Kuhn or Bob Justman, or whoever said, but don't throw those away. Those can be Dr. McCoy's operating instruments.
Absolutely.
And so it came to be.
Flip side to that, though, is you have something like the Battlestar Galactica reboot, where every single thing in there could be found at a local hardware store now. And I think that the goofy flea market salt shaker really does do a lot of world building, because when I see Starbuck fiddling around with what's very clearly a popular brand padlock, it takes you out of the moment. And
yes,
you cut some slack, other things you got to stick to it. And that's the suspension of disbelief and Star Trek have a long and weird history together. Like, at what point do you have to stop and say, no, man, that's a dude in a trash bag. I can't with this anymore.
Well, actually, I'll tell you what, I'll compare and contrast two episodes of the original series, both of which are beloved, and one works much better for me than the other. Okay. So I'll start with The Devil in the Dark, which is one of my absolute favorite episodes. Again, because it's so much of it is about who Spock and Kirk are. And it's about Spock's scientific curiosity, making him not want to kill what might be the last creature of its kind until his beloved captain is in danger. And then he's all like, Jim, shoot it, it's going to attack you. That's beautiful. But the Horta looks like a duvet wearing a pizza. I mean, it's dreadful. It's a bad prop. Okay. But exactly what the Horta looks like is never a key part of the plot. So I can just go with that. I can just roll with it. Okay. But speaking of books, a lot of my early recollections of Star Trek, because it was so difficult to watch the episodes when I was a kid, is in book form. And there were these, James Blish wrote short story versions of, it would be like 5 or 6 episodes per book. I picked, I think, just kind of at random from episodes that people liked. And several times watching these episodes a couple of years ago, I found whole lines, whole bits of the prose renderings of those episodes from James Blish coming back into my memory, because I'd read and reread them when I was 9 or 10 years old. So let's talk about Spectre of the Gun. So it's absolutely crucial for the ending of this episode for it to be very, very difficult indeed for our heroes to believe they are in anything other than a real Wild West town where bad guys with guns are about to pump lead into them. However, because of budget limitations, the Wild West town, which is supposed to be so real, consists of 3 flats dotted around the soundstage at random with great gaps everywhere. And here's where I think and they talk about it. They say this is referred to. It's not referred to in the James Blish version, as far as I can remember. And that would have been so much of a more powerful episode if it had looked like A Fistful of Datas. If it had looked like a real Wild West town with no gaps, no holes, and didn't look like a slightly impoverished fringe theatre show. And that's where I think the suspension of disbelief comes less willingly to me.
I find that's the part of the suspension of disbelief that Peter and I kind of successfully managed to succeed in. Maybe it's because we've, lived a life adjacent to or involved with low budget production, such that I kind of see what you meant to do.
Well, listen, I grew up watching Doctor Who, and Doctor Who would always be looking enviously at Star Trek's budget in the 60s and saying,
Oh,
if
yeah.
only we had that kind of money. Early episodes of Doctor Who were made for £2,500 per episode. I mean,
they look like it.
They do look like it. Exactly. But when everything else looks glossy and sharp and well realized, something like your Western town is 3/4 missing is harder to overlook.
Well, budget became a very big topic of our conversation in season 3 of Enterprise. As it became clear that this was a dead-end TV show that was going to make it to 100 episodes so it could be syndicated and then be promptly flushed on a network that was failing, it took away the crutch to lean on cool space battles and flashy money stuff, and it really forced the show to start doing what Star Trek has thrived at and what you've gotten the best Star Trek out of, and that's small set drama with good scripts and actors who understand what's going on. And by the end, season 4 is just cobbled together with masking tape and paper clips.
Because they don't have 2 and 3 part episodes, so they don't have to build so many sets.
Absolutely, and bring in so many other different things. But man, the mileage they get out of that, I think, and maybe we need to dip our toe a little bit here into New Trek, which has just been flush with cash. And I don't know where you're at on that stuff, but I would not say it's been the proudest moments of Trek. A few shining examples aside, Star Trek is something that does great with limited budget and forces the writers to have to think instead of just saying, okay, how many lasers can we fit on the screen in this?
Yeah.
When you force them to be theater actors, they all have to up their game. They don't have a choice. There's nothing else to carry what's going on.
Yeah, one of the things that makes watching early Next Generation fun is seeing American TV actors who have spent most of their careers playing lawyers and professionals in suits, trying to figure out what to do with their hands now they're in these spandex jumpsuits. But of course, the one actor who looks very comfortable right from the very beginning is Patrick Stewart, because he spent 15 years at the Royal Shakespeare Company playing kings in tights, and he knows just how to appear high status without worrying about what to do with his hands.
Patrick Stewart, the built-in cheat codes of Next Generation.
Yes.
How bad can your show be when you have one of the best actors to ever do it out there making your script sound like solid gold?
And such a battle to get him cast over Gene Roddenberry's objections, which seems incredible now. But yeah, he's the atlas on which that show is balancing for at least the first 50 episodes.
Absolutely. To watch everybody have to up their game around him and watch the writers have to figure out, like, how do we get real mileage out of this guy? Early Next Gen is such a wild thing. And what always stands out to me is, like, the defining feature is the episode with Picard, and then Damon Bach that comes around with the Ferengi thought machine and starts screwing with him with part of it over on the Stargazer.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Crusher, like, oh my God, what is this? I haven't seen this ever in my entire medical career. I believe it's called a headache. And just everybody, this unrealistic presentation of the point humanity is in, where it's almost inaccessible to the modern viewer. And as the years would go on, they would really slide things back to more realistic, in some cases, grimmier and dirtier version of humanity. But the early Next Gen stuff, it really feels like humanity is an alien in and of itself in terms of what they've accomplished, the mental state that they're in this post scarcity utopia.
Too perfect. Yeah.
Where do you kind of draw the line in TNG to the point where, like, all right, they understand what's going on here, and now we're touching a real product and not a prototype anymore?
I think it's a very tricky balancing act. I think it's one of the reasons why Deep Space Nine ends up so often being the kind of the connoisseur's Trek. It's pretty inaccessible, and that devotion to serialization makes life really tough if you're not prepared to do as I did and just sit down and watch it from the beginning. But what it does do is enables us to see these people to whom we can aspire, where inside Starfleet there's no, as you say, there's no scarcity, there's no want, there's no conflict. Everybody is super good at their job. Everybody is nice and respectful. But you then bring that into conflict with with Cardassians, with Ferengi, with Bajorans who hate Cardassians, even though they're supposed to be the good guys. And we get to see a part of the universe which the Federation hasn't managed to buff and wipe clean. And I think that does favors to both, because it gets depressing to live in a world which is all about grime and misery and poverty and pain. And I don't want to tune into that every single week. But you can see the strain on Next Gen, because they keep having to come up with more and more stories about perfect people solving elegant space problems.
Have you gone through Voyager yet?
Oh yeah. No, I've done everything. It's all in the rear view. Well, one of the things I do find fascinating, and this is just one of those sort of quirks of fate, but it is odd that the series about the people who hang out in a space mall is the one about generational trauma and the horrors of war, and the one about the lone band of desperate survivors clinging to the wreckage of their ship on the other side of the galaxy is the one about optimistic exploration and bonkers time travel.
Well, I mean, that's what drove what's his face off to go make
Ron Moore, yeah.
Ron Moore, yes.
Did it the right way. Voyager had some really high peaks and some low valleys, and it was just infuriating every week to watch a new episode, because we do one episode a week, and just see these guys by the end hit that homeostasis reset button. Everything's just the way it started off, and once we get into the next episode, whatever happened last week, we have taken so many forgetty pills that nobody remembers. And it's that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Voyager's made of reset button.
And that was the refreshing thing for us going in Enterprise. It's like, wow, these guys are building on their own experiences and their own adventures, and the characters are growing. That was maddening with Voyager, just these guys and character loops they couldn't escape. B'Elanna Torres specifically. How many times can you tell the story that she doesn't like being half Klingon, only for the next episode for her to hate being half Klingon, even though she'd kind of, reached this catharsis last episode?
5 times, as we covered. We were going to do that plot 5 times.
Yeah, well, this is something that plagues TNG as well. I call it, this is the story we tell with this character. So you have a character, and so how many times can we tell the Geordie can't get a girlfriend story? How many times can we tell the Troy and or Crusher is molested by alien space ghosts story? It turns out a lot. And so there's this fine line between consistent characterization and this is the story we tell with this character.
Did you catch Picard season 3?
Oh yeah, no, I'm up to date because I haven't sat down and written reviews. I'm not as comprehensively well versed on the latest shows as I am with the ones I've done for the books. But yeah, no, I've seen everything.
Watching season 3 of Picard was such a pure delight, especially in terms of the treatment of Troy and Crusher and turning them from these worthless potted plants into like important parts of the plot, and really presenting those characters in the correct light. Just stuff that, as you said, they're just forever out of grasp for the writers back in the day.
I did have a few content-specific questions for you, Tom, based on what I was able to read in your book.
What have I got wrong?
Not at all. Nothing you got wrong, actually. Just want to explore some of your thoughts. Again, very much want to encourage folks to go acquire the book for themselves. That would be Star Trek Discovering the TV Series, available on Amazon as of March 30th.
I am reminded of Tom Lehre's comment, these are my views, and if you don't like them, I have others.
So your review of the motion picture, I really agree with your analysis that the film's bloated reputation is a little unearned. It's really only a couple hours long.
Yeah, by modern standards, it's positively svelte.
It's breezy, but it does feel bloated because it has this content that doesn't appear to be important to the story that seems to dominate its runtime.
Yeah, or the bits don't. I figured this out just the other day. This isn't in the book, but the only person who has a consistent arc through that story is Spock. And I think that's precisely because he was a last-minute addition. So everything else is a product of, we're going to make a new Star Trek movie. No, we're going to make Star Trek Phase 2 for television. And we probably won't have William Shatner. We probably won't have Leonard Nimoy, so we better create alternative versions. So let's have Zon and Ilea and Decker. Oh no, we are going to do it for the movies. Okay, well let's have a look at these Phase 2 scripts. And so all this stuff gets kind of mashed together to make a screenplay. And then at the last minute, was it Robert Wise's daughter said, "Daddy, you can't have Star Trek without Spock in it," and they made one last appeal to Leonard Nimoy. And so now at this point, somebody has to ask the question, what is Spock's journey through this film? And he is the only character in that film for which that question was asked and answered. So he has something resembling an arc, and nobody else does.
So I asked this to set up, have you seen the Star Trek Legacy recut of motion picture? Have you even heard of it?
No, I haven't. Tell me more.
So this is a favorite of Peter and I, and we inflict this on as many people as we possibly can. There is approximately a 35-minute recut of the film.
35 minutes?
35 minutes. It cuts out a lot of this bloat that we're talking about, and it is done to the Tron Legacy soundtrack. And it works so much better than you'd ever think.
Well, I mean, the soundtrack is pretty good as it stands.
It's amazing. And this thing, it's just, you put it on the background, it's good music, it's the iconic scenes. I think it keeps kind of like that art housey feel, but it's still clearly Star Trek. And as far as fan-made recuts, it's the best light, I think, to present the motion picture. But I liked your trope question there, Joe, especially touched on a little earlier.
You identify in the same review that there's this specific trope that begins in the motion picture and repeats itself ad nauseum through Trek from this point forward, which is new character shows up, gets eliminated some way.
Yes. Yeah, he's revealed as traitor or he's killed off.
So
that's why it's such a pleasure to see, what's her name, Gillian, go off into the future at the end of Star Trek 4, because it violates the contract.
Right. They don't do anything with it, but at least she's still there.
Yes.
She didn't betray them. So how do we name this trope, Tom? Because it's real and it keeps happening, but I've never heard it like named something.
So it's sort of a version of red shirting, isn't it?
Kind of, but it's very specific, right? Like, mysterious new character shows up, is the focus of the story, ultimately betrays what's going on.
Could you call it just last in, first out?
Last in, first out. That works. I mean, we'll have to workshop that. We got to find some way to wind a betrayal into it.
Yeah.
But it was such a good observation on your part of like, well, they just keep doing this from this point forward. Whenever they get the chance.
I'd go sidetracked, maybe. Just a short, single-serving character that's there and gone. Hey, wasn't that fun?
Sidetracked. Okay.
Short, yeah.
I like that. So, Wrath of Khan, iconic film. Hard to really even find a single flaw with it. Nick Meyer, knowing nothing about Trek, you point out what we also pointed out. Horatio Hornblower turning it into sort of a British naval drama. Turns out that was a great look. That super worked. That's somebody who didn't know anything about Trek, had a new creative vision, got everyone to buy in, including the actors who put in A-level effort, and then suddenly revitalized this entire property.
You must know what Nick Meyer said about directing William Shatner.
No, I'm afraid I don't.
He said the trick with William Shatner is you've got to do a lot of takes. Because the first 10 or 12 takes, he's doing all this acting. But after about take 13 or 14, he gets bored. And then he just says the lines. And then he's great.
Wear him out.
So that directing style is just basically a cat with a laser pointer getting it to go higher and higher up the wall until you take all the energy out.
So, Tom, do you think there is somebody with creative talent out there today that could do the same thing with Trek now? I mean, even if you're okay with where Trek has been, I think there's a fair assessment to be made. It's lost a lot of its cultural purchase. It could use revitalization. So is there a Nick Meyer out there that you think could be trusted to take Trek and do something new with it?
Well, I mean, the cultural landscape is so different now than it was in 1981, 1982. It was completely feasible for someone in 1981, 1982 to say, I've never seen Star Trek. Because it's one TV show. It's 79 episodes and one movie which got bad reviews. So if you're a busy writer-director and you're not particularly a science fiction person and you're kind of aware that there was a show on in the 60s called Star Trek and there was a character called Spock in it, it's feasible for you never to have seen it. But we are now awash with Star Trek content. and there are, what is it now, 13 different series, another 13 movies, including the J.J. Abrams ones. And it's been going on for 60 years. It's impossible to get away from it. So a person like Nick Meyer couldn't come unspoiled in the way that he did. Couldn't come and just look at the material and say, what would make a good story? The other thing that's fascinating, I think, behind the scenes is that on a certain level, the motion picture and Wrath of Khan were written in the same way. Somebody had to take a great big pile of scripts that didn't really make sense and turn them into a movie. But Nick Meyer did it in something like 10 days.
I guess it speaks to his ability, though, right? Like, that's why he was such a good creative mind, is he was able just to figure it out.
Well, there's that kind of pressure. You're just like, I just have to find something here that works. And again, I can't remember. I don't think this is in the book. I think it might have been in the long version. But he was brought on by Harve Bennett to direct, was shown this pile of scripts and said, okay, tell me all the things you like in these different scripts. I think there's enough here for me to stitch you together into a coherent screenplay. And Harve Bennett said, that's all well and good, but we start shooting in 2 weeks. And Nick Meyer said, I think I can do it in 2 weeks. And Harve Bennett said, Nick, we couldn't do your deal in 2 weeks. And that's why he has no credit as the screenwriter.
Right. Like,
he just
you're
said,
going to have to do it, and you're not getting anything for it.
He did it unpaid. He took his fee as director, and the film was such a smash, and Star Trek fans celebrated him ever since. So, they knew where the credit should be given, but he gets no on-screen credit because it was also last minute.
If there's a detailed oriented group of fans out there that can read between the lines, Star Trek's the place where you want to plant that. Out of curiosity, have you watched any of the Orville yet?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
What's your take on that?
It's weird. It starts off very goofy, and not all the humor works. And then, very bizarrely, the less funny it tries to be, the more successful it is. But I just don't really know quite who it's for, other than Seth MacFarlane, who is clearly having a wonderful time. And there are great stories there. But it doesn't have the lived-in feel of the best of Star Trek. It doesn't feel like a coherent universe in the same way. And then when those Family Guy-style jokes start coming up again, which I had begun to miss in the more successful dramatic episodes, they are now an unwelcome distraction. So it always feels a bit uncertain to me, even though there's real quality there in much of it.
Yeah, Orville's, I think, a great example of Star Trek doesn't understand how to be Star Trek anymore, and the people not associated but fans of Star Trek are able to tap into the stuff that, like, the guys making the paychecks from Paramount just can't seem to get their hands around a lot.
So I have some questions for you as it relates to TNG and some things that Peter and I are about to embark on, because we're about to do DS9.
Okay.
And we decided to do a little homework, right? We decided we should probably crack open TNG and take a look at some of the episodes that actually you identify within your book as being clear pieces of the roadmap towards DS9 launching as a show. So we're talking about The Wounded, we're talking about Ensign Rowe, and we're talking about Chain of Command.
Oh, yeah.
So first, do you have any other TNG episodes that come to mind that might serve as good homework, particularly for my friend Peter here, who needs to bone up for launching into deep space?
Let me think. I do find it that unlike Doctor Who, where the story about the terrible Vervoids who kill everyone is the one called The Terror of the Vervoids. Star Trek titles are often very hard to separate out.
Usually
I was going to say Ensign Rowe if you hadn't already had that on the list, because tonally it's very Deep Space Nine-ish, even though it doesn't have I suppose it's setting up part of the Bajoran-Cardassian conflict, isn't it?
It is. And it's also like such a clear indication that the intention very much was to have Michelle Forbes actually on DS9, which is probably the most famous part of the lore, was her decision to refuse that opportunity.
And I think they offered Kira to Susie Plaxton as well, which would have been interesting.
Oh, did they? Yeah. I think they made a better choice with
Nana Visitor
the
is
casting.
Fantastic. Yeah, actually, I wouldn't change it for anything. But it's these things that never were. Was Journey's End on your list?
No.
Okay. Oh, you should watch Journey's End.
Okay.
Is that the Wesley Crusher one?
Yeah.
Mm.
I know, but
Oh, that does have to do with some stuff in the DMZ, doesn't it? That's
Yes.
right.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
that would be good to include.
That was the one we suspected may have actually been Chakotay's colony.
Oh, and you say you finished watching Enterprise or not yet?
We're about to do These Are the Voyages.
Have you watched the Pegasus?
The Pegasus.
Oh, yeah. I guess we might watch the Pegasus.
Yeah. Pegasus firstly is a fantastic episode, but also it is quite useful homework before you watch the last episode of Enterprise.
It's true. Yeah, Peter, you should probably watch Pegasus before you watch the finale. Actually, I do recommend it.
All right, I can give that one a go again. It's a good one. I always enjoyed it.
And so in keeping with this question, and maybe this is the right note to leave off on, Tom, because this is
preemptive strike as well from season 7.
Oh, is that the second to last episode?
Yeah, it was the return of Rolaran, and it's the penultimate episode.
Okay, that makes sense because that's my big Maquis episode.
Yeah.
So my final question to you, because it has to do with one of the episodes we've been talking about, and that is Chain of Command, and that is Captain Jellico was right the whole time, right? Like, let's be real, okay? Like, let's have that conversation.
It's amazing how, going back to what you were saying before about Crusher and Troy and how good they are in Picard season 3, it's amazing how much better Troy is the second she puts on that uniform. Oh, yeah. Suddenly she has stuff to do. What's the one where time keeps stopping and starting?
Gosh, can't summon that from my brain.
Is that the one where they're out of phase?
Timescape. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's basically Picard and put our hand into the bag of ping pong balls with the rest of the regular cast names written on them and pluck out which 3 characters are going to accompany him today. And one of them is Troy. And Troy season 4 or 5 would have been just I sense danger, Captain. This Troy is as good at problem solving as any of the rest of the crew, and it's all to do with putting her in the uniform. So yeah, he's definitely right about that. I think I can't make up my mind watching the episode, which I think is a strength, by the way, not a weakness. I can't make up my mind whether, as you say, he's right about everything, or whether the thing he's wrong about is that a captain needs the trust of the crew and not merely the fear of the crew, or whether his behavior, which ends up alienating the crew, is a specific response by him to the gravity of the situation. And if the crew are not absolutely on their toes about every little thing, then mistakes are going to be made.
It's a deep episode, and it also highlights another thing that came up a few times for us, which is, what is Starfleet really at its core? Because every time we see some other facet of Starfleet in Next Gen, it's a crooked captain or some sort of conspiracy going on with, aliens with their tails sticking out of the backs of someone's neck. Is the 24th century Starfleet really the shining beacon of humanity that you would think it is by watching the crew of the Enterprise? Or is Picard somehow assembled this hippie commune where he has brought the most idealistic, best, lawful good people together, and Starfleet was like, good, get all these dickheads on one ship, send them out into deep space, and the rest of us are going to be rotten over here close to home.
I was on another podcast just the other day, and they introduced me, I wish I'd thought of this myself, they introduced me to the term Badmiral. It does seem as if
crazy Starfleet Admiral syndrome.
Exactly.
I think we've all got a different way of having identified that trope. Yeah.
And part of this is just it's just tropey storytelling. It's one of those things that you want our guys to be the best of the best. You want them to be the ones who get it right. One of the problems I have with Enterprise, as discussed, is the crew comes off as doofuses more often than not. But if our guys are right about everything, well, one of the unfortunate consequences of that is that sort of means that everyone else they come into contact with has to be wrong about everything. One of the other tropes I noticed is the Patrician Federation, who turns up on a planet that's had a perfectly serviceable culture that's worked for dozens, maybe hundreds of generations, and they identify the flaw in it and sort it out in half an hour and then fuck off back to the Alpha Quadrant. It's...
hey, they're the best of the best, right?
Exactly.
And isn't that the whole theme of the Lower Decks cartoon, which I enjoy, that, someone's got to go out there and
fantastic.
Deal with the fallout. My closing question for you is, now that you've got this book out or ready to get it out, what is the one pervasive shower thought you want people taking away from this. Like, they read the book and then 8 months later they're taking a shower and that thing from your book to pop back and then just be like,
Ooh. It kind of comes back to what we were just talking about, I think. That the rules, especially as formulated by Gene Roddenberry for Next Generation, where our characters are right about everything and never come into conflict with each other and live in this post-scarcity society, and yet we're going to tell exciting adventure stories with them. It gives you very little room to maneuver. But I think precisely because of that, when Next Gen and its successor series gets it right, and they're building on what was done in the original series and the movies and the animated series, they are telling stories like no other. And I think it is that optimism about the future that is the secret sauce that makes Star Trek what it is. And I think that's the big problem with Discovery, which there are episodes of Discovery I like, but the fashion when Discovery started was to tell stories that are dark and gritty and about the worst aspects of humanity. And what they miss is that Star Trek tells us we can do better.
Yes.
And that's what I come to it for.
Well, it's hard to do better than your book, Tom.
Oh, bless you.
So once more, it is Star Trek Discovering the TV Series, one of what will hopefully be a series of books by you, Tom Salinsky, that will be released on March 30th, available on Amazon, available online at Barnes & Noble if you're an American like us. Tom, is there anything else you would like our audience to know?
Not really. You can follow me on Twitter at Tom Salinsky. I have a podcast which is sort of in abeyance now, but I'm putting a bit of Star Trek content on there to help promote the book. But that's called Best Pick. It began with us watching every movie that won Best Picture at the Academy Awards in an order determined by pulling them out of a hat at random. So that's still going, bestpickpod.com. Just see you around and live long and prosper and all that good stuff.
Yes, thank you so much for your time today, Tom. And then thank you very much for listening. For everyone out there on Future Police Land, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.